two, one, two, three.
Hello, I'm David Foote, an organizer and activist with the Ithaca chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. We're joined today by David Friedman, a labor organizer for about 50 years, a devoted Marxist since her teenage years, and a Vermonter until she moved to Ithaca a few years ago. So the asterisk there was a comrade of Bernie Sanders since the 70s. Ellen is now a full-time passionate volunteer in the labor movement, primarily working through labor notes. Ellen, thank you for joining us.
It's a great pleasure. Good to see you.
So to start off our conversation today, can you talk a little bit about your philosophy, your thoughts on the need for organizing? What's the promise of a union, and what can working people gain by cooperating and planning together?
Yeah, well, my sort of thoughts about organizing and this whole sphere of questions that you've posed um, is within the framework of actual existing capitalism, the system that we are all trapped within. And my concept from a very early age was that we were going to do best in the world if we paid attention to the real existing conditions instead of some fantasy, either what we love to see or being angry at what was actually going on. Pay attention to it, figure it out, and then figure out what is possible to transform within that system given all the historical conditions, so Marxism is a great asset in that worldview because it's got gives you a very practical study of the life cycle of capitalism, how it works, how it operates, what are its strengths, what are its weaknesses, and what are the options that people face within it. And I always took really seriously this, notion from Marx that we do get to make history, but not under conditions of our own choosing. So in deciding to become a labor organizer early on in my life, in the early 1970s, it was because two things. One, I very much believed that under conditions of capitalism, the only way that we really challenge and build power that can challenge both capitalists and the system as a whole is if we organize in the workplace, because that's where value is created. That's where profit is created. That's where value is taken from us and all workers every day and then turned into political and economic power that's used against us. So why not go right into the heart of the bullseye, or as Marx called it, the hidden abode of the workplace, and see what's possible to organize there. So I've always believed that that was an essential place of work and felt incredibly lucky to be able to find my way into that field. Now, having said that, the last 40 or 50 years in the US labor movement have been fairly dreadful. It's been the period of time in which the rise of neoliberalism was not really clearly understood, certainly was not clearly understood by us on the left for a long time. That is to say, what was its character? What were its methods of work? How was it transforming the workforce? How was it transforming labor capital relations? Were kind of obscure. And many members of my generation who had come out of the student left or the new left in the 1960s fell away in the period of the 1980s and 90s and got, sorry to say, distracted by ideas that somehow if you just came up with really good, smart policy, good public policy for housing or for healthcare or for education, that you could deal with all the horrors and the degradations that neoliberalism was creating. And I never believed that because any policy that is not backed by the force of class power is going to be meaningless. And unfortunately, that's what we saw, really starting in the mid-70s onward, which is that the protections that we collectively had won in society after more than 100 years of really fierce kind of class struggle and class warfare. Probably the modern era and the US era beginning after the Civil War, just endless battles of Black people and Native Americans and Chicanos or Latinx people, women workers, workers of all sorts, industrial workers, service workers, retail workers, pitched battles for really 100 years, were successful in the sense that we won arguably fairly strong labor rights to form unions, to negotiate contracts, to protect workers against retaliation if they organized in their own behalf, to win health and safety protections for all kinds of workers, most notably, of course, for coal miners. Those literally were coal mine wars that had to take place, where people died in those struggles to win the most basic safety protections, to win the minimum wage and the weekend and Medicare and Medicaid, all of those things. However, we came to the end of a period of great expansiveness, as I'm sure most of your listeners or watchers know, and that post-World War II period in which U.S. capitalism was able to distribute some goods to workers and to create a middle class, really became too expensive. The capitalist class was no longer interested in redistributing that wealth, and that's what we think of as the neoliberal era, was a concentration and a great acceleration of the concentration of wealth and power. So anyway, in my lifetime, even though some of us coming out of the New Left were very devoted to the labor movement itself was failing dreadfully to take account of these changed conditions. And that's why I started with the principle that Marxism helps us, says, like, see reality as it is. Kind of a little like Buddhism in that way, Let's just look at reality for what's really happening and then make a plan. And the reality was vast deindustrialization, vast deregulation, tremendous interventions by the state to concentrate wealth and power. So beginning again in the 1980s was the rewriting of a tax code, which had been largely a fairly progressive tax code in the US since really World War I. And to rewrite it, as we understand, to protect wealth. That was very successful. To begin to starve government, public services, that was an explicit path of neoliberalism. To go after public sector workers fiercely, which has happened, which we continue to see to this very day. And to basically, break what arguably you could call the social contract with the American people. And unions, which should have been up on their hind legs screaming and yelling about this and going on massive strikes and engaging in all kinds of serious resistance, were not. They had been bought into a notion, again, this is part of the neoliberal kind of game plan, that what they should be doing is creating transactional relationships with the Democrats. And so that's more or less what happened. And unions became very hollow. I'm sad to say I witnessed this in my career, and separated from their own members. Members were really turned into kind of customers. Many people saw their union membership as being more like an insurance company, having an insurance policy in case something bad happened to them, as opposed to a place where they could come together for the purpose of learning what self-governance meant. So for me, to get back to the question of my philosophy, every worker needs a union. Doesn't matter, public sector, private sector, nonprofit, gig worker, doesn't matter. Um, Workers need unions not so much for negotiating for improved wages and benefits, that's important, but really because that's a space where workers can learn to listen to one another, treat one another with respect, which is not what the employer will ever do, and learn how to self-govern in forms of kind of radical participatory democracy. And we got to learn that if we want to challenge capitalism and take over the world. So anyway, that's been my love in the labor movement. That's what I've uh, tried to do in my work.
Thank you. I can certainly vouch for the recent history you outlined as someone who was born in the 80s in the Rust Belt, Western Pennsylvania. I was in college before I even heard someone be skeptical of the idea that unions weren't dangerous. And every low-wage job I've ever had, we were trained from the first day that were given our name badge that this was something to be wary of.
Absolutely.
But of course, working with a socialist organization, talking with organizers, seeing people both from veteran organizing standpoints and young folks who are brand new to this idea of forming a union. It's been interesting to watch. As you mentioned, labor does have this rich history in our country that's been obscured and diluted over years of anti-union propaganda.
Mm.
Are there lessons we can learn from US or international labor movements, as well as the backlash that put us where we are?
Yes, absolutely. There are many, many lessons. And it's pretty interesting um, because, really when you read history, what it's easy to see is that the political economic backstory at any moment in history will create certain conditions which result in a certain kind of not uniform, but a certain generalized response. This is not a big shock, um, but we can see that the last major resistance to capitalism on what we could call a global scale was in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And many some Marxist scholars would agree that that was because the stage of capitalism at which the U.S. Political economic class was at the center um, was had exhausted itself. It was coming to its end, which is what every cycle of capitalism does, and that there was going to be a pretty rocky ride for some period of time as the decline settled in and the next center of global capital would appear. Now, at the time, you know, we weren't, the outcome wasn't really obvious because it was a bipolar, it was really a kind of a tripolar world, I guess. So you had the communist bloc, Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cuba, the Eastern European countries. You had the capitalist bloc, North America, much of the EU, Western Europe, and so on, and the non-aligned nations, parts of Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia. But with the collapse of the communist sphere, first the Soviet Union and then China, um, the US, the world becoming a single capitalist enterprise, really. I mean, there were pockets where Western capital has not penetrated, but anyway, it appears as if the center really is moving to China. This is not a novel idea, obviously. Many people think this. Um, so I was so discouraged by what was happening in the U.S. labor movement by the end of the 90s that I was getting a little dispirited with the whole project, and an opportunity came up in our lives to go to China and look around, and did so, and ended up spending 10 years living and working in China between 2005 and 2015. And I had, for half of each year, we would be in China and then we'd return to the US, my husband Stuart and I. And during that time, I got very involved in the labor movement at many different levels. I was able to teach labor studies at university and worked with the grassroots movement and little tiny worker centers, with the trade union, which is, that was quite a trip. It's a department of government, has purportedly 300 million members, but, nobody knows actually they're a member of the union. And got involved with labor scholars and labor journalists and so on. And here's what happened. I thought it seemed very exotic. I had no idea what was going on. I mean, it took me really years to figure out just what was the world I was looking at there. And then it gradually began to come into focus. And every year when I came back, I said, oh, this is where we're all moving. And that's what's happened. So many, many features of what we would have to call a post-neoliberal world. I don't know if there's a name for it yet, but whatever the next cycle of capitalism is going to have Chinese characteristics. Already does. And it was very important to learn from that. So I'll just give one specific example. One of the things I was totally overwhelmed by in my early days in China was, there's a huge migrant worker population, Chinese peasants having moved into the cities starting really in the 1990s, and working in sweatshop factories initially in the coast, but now, of course, it's spread into the inland provinces. So hundreds of millions, 300 million, 400 million workers, and they job hop with unbelievable frequency. So in the early days, people would go and get a factory job, and then they'd go home for the Chinese New Year, which is in January, and stay home for a month, and then come back and go to another factory. Very typical. But also, if you went to a factory and you didn't like the food that was served in the canteen, or your boss was too mean, or the hours of overtime were too long, or there was no air conditioning in your factory or whatever, you just leave. And I didn't understand how you could organize a union or organize just any workers' organization with that much instability. I'm still not sure I know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that that's a lot more what our workforce looks like now. And this constant flux in and out of low-wage jobs. And here, there are service, logistics, retail, even professional level jobs, and the amount of gig working that's going on. So one thing I would say is that the labor movement is already confronted with a question about what do we do with a labor market that capitalism has remade. I mean, capitalism always makes new labor markets. That's what it does. And this one is not going to be organized in the way the last labor market was. It's not like guys who are getting factory jobs and they work the same job for 30 years and they get their paycheck and go home, buy a house and have a pension. It's not. And so how do workers organize under conditions of this kind of constant insecurity and precariousness is a question we have to answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I was partway through asking that one when I realized, this is a topic that there's libraries of research and analysis about. So we'll certainly keep thinking and talking about it. So the last thing, Alan, that I wanted to talk about today is a national project that both of us have had some involvement with, the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. So to just speak up from my own experience and my own knowledge of it, it's a large-scale project coordinated by the Democratic Socialists of America, as well as United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America. And this was formed with the purpose of sharing resources, networks, and training, like some of the questions you talked about, some of the ways to frame workplace organizing. making these available for people who are trying to make demands in their workplace related to the COVID-19 crisis. So this could be demands for protective equipment, hazard pay, adequate staffing, paid leave, or even a union drive. If folks who are watching are interested, you can find details at workerorganizing.org. That's workerorganizing.org, where really anyone who's looking to address problems in their workplaces can find organizing resources, sign up for training sessions, and potentially link up with a union organizer to talk one-on-one. So that was a quick summary. What else would you say about this EWOC for someone who's curious?
Yeah, no, it's a great description, David. So this EWOC project is so experimental. It is such a lovely and bold and confident experiment that just blossomed at a moment when it was needed. And DSA was kind of the perfect platform for it, in a sense that DSA had attracted many, obviously, thousands of people in the last couple of years, particularly. Um, a significant number of whom see the workplace as a place where leftists should pay attention. Not everybody in DSA, obviously, but a really healthy percentage. And so the idea was, well, let's throw up a platform where workers who are looking for some help can log in. It's very simple, and you just fill out a little form, you get onto a spreadsheet, and I don't know, like in the first couple of weeks, there were like hundreds and hundreds logged in with a question or a request for help. So then the question was, well, what are we going to do with all of them? How are we going to help them all? Because this is not the kind of work that typical union organizers do. Like many union organizers work in a much more narrow frame. Like they try and help people organize a union that's recognized by the labor board, and then bargain a contract, and then file and process grievances and arbitrations. Very formal, legalistic processes. So you're not going to probably find lots and lots of union organizers who are, working, that are going to give a lot of time to this. There are a few, veterans like myself, some other people who have been around doing this for a long time, are retired and love the labor movement. So a bunch of us have volunteered. But what we found pretty quickly was the need to really help people learn how to become organizers quickly. So there is a great intake process, and now people are sort of sorted out. Like every day, there'll be people on this Slack thread saying, "We need someone to talk to an Amazon warehouse worker in Idaho who's like they're not giving them any PPE and blah blah blah." So it's all kinds of workers that come in, and they get an initial intake or an initial assessment. Sometimes they just have a quick question and you can answer it. And other times they are kind of advanced to someone else who will help them try and figure out whether there's any potential for organizing in their workplace, either organizing a campaign or organizing a union. And if there's some potential for that, they would get passed on to somebody who will help guide them through that process. So it does feel like it is a very accelerated process for getting people into into the labor movement and helping them learn stuff. There's a great 6-week training program that's been developed. I think you've been through it, David, I believe, and I don't know the number, but some hundreds of people have already been through it. And I actually met with the training team yesterday and heard a little more from them about what they do. So it's, and they are constantly adapting and changing what they do to meet the needs as they see them. So it's really quite exhilarating. It's kind of free form. It's been evolving a lot since it got started in March or April, and nobody knows exactly where it will go. Some of these leads are going to existing unions, to UE, as you mentioned, or sometimes to other unions if that's appropriate, to actually have campaigns. And in other cases, it's more like a single fight. You have a fight with the boss and try and win something, and then you're done. But what a great way to help get people introduced to the idea of power. So I'm quite excited about it.
Me too. Thank you. So this has been Ithaca, Democratic Socialists of America presents, with guest Ellen David Friedman, longtime labor organizer. We talked about history, the present, international issues, both theory and practice. Are there any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
No, just delighted, delighted that we are at a moment in history where so many people hopefully can find a beloved community in this work.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a good day.
Thanks so much.
That was Ithaca DSA Chair David Foote interviewing labor organizer Ellen David Friedman. In the last part, the interview was about the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, usually referred to as EWOC. Again, EWOC can be reached at workerorganizing.org. All one word, workerorganizing.org. And you can find Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America at ithacadsa.org. That's ithacadsa.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.